In this video, we're taking a look at something that we've all experienced, except if, like me, you were born via C-section. But most of us have experienced this, and that's the stages of labor and birth. Although you're probably too young to remember when you experienced these stages. We'll briefly cover the anatomy of pregnancy, then get an overview of the process of labor and birth, and finally we'll do a deep dive into the 3 stages: dilation, expulsion, and the placental stage. Throughout the video, to visualize the whole process, we'll look at a birth simulation from Anatomage, the maker of the world's first life-size virtual dissection table. Their birth simulation is a 3D model constructed from an actual human body, ensuring the highest level of anatomical accuracy for learning. And by the end of this video, you'll know more than you ever have about those final moments leading up to a baby's first cry and breath. Let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So let's start with the anatomy of pregnancy. First of all, we have a mid-sagittal cross-section of the mother. You see the belly is very big there. We're at the end of the pregnancy, ready to give birth. First, let's draw in some structures that aren't part of the reproductive system, but will help us kind of orient where things are. First, we've got the spine right there. We have the pubic symphysis, which is the piece of cartilage between the 2 halves of the pelvis. We have the colon right here, connected to the anus. We've got the bladder and the urethra, which is connected to the vulva right there. Now, those aren't the structures we're concerned with, so we're going to gray those out and draw in the reproductive anatomy now. So first we have the uterus. As you can see, the uterus is filling up most of the space. It contains the baby, which has been growing and developing over the course of the 9 months of the pregnancy, and so that uterus is many times its original size. We have the vagina, which is going to connect from the uterus down to the vulva right here. And between the uterus and the vagina, we have some tissue called the cervix. This right here is the cervix. And later on, we're going to talk about the cervix opening up, dilating, and effacing so the baby can come out. We have the vulva, which is the area where the vaginal canal and the urethra are going to connect on the external part of the body. Inside the uterus, we've got a couple things. First, we've got the placenta, which is this mass of tissue that's going to conduct nutrients from the mother's bloodstream into the baby through the umbilical cord. We have the baby or the fetus itself, which has been developing in the uterus. And we have the umbilical cord, which is connecting the placenta to the baby where the belly button will be eventually. And that's going to contain blood vessels that are delivering oxygen and nutrients and water, all the stuff that the baby needs in through that belly button from the mother, as well as getting rid of waste and sending it back to the placenta. Because at this point, the baby isn't eating anything, it's not breathing, it's not pooping, or I guess it's peeing some. So it has to exchange all the nutrients it needs with the mother. And the baby is surrounded by amniotic fluid, which is contained in the amniotic sac, which is a little bit hard to draw on the diagram, so I just kind of covered it in a blue translucent layer here to show that fluid that the baby is in. Now let's take a look at the visuals from Anatomage and see these structures in 3 dimensions. First, we have the vagina right here in light blue. Up here we have the uterus, and of course the cervix, which is separating the uterus from the vagina. We've got the amniotic fluid, which is surrounding the baby as it develops. We've got the placenta right here, which is taking nutrients from the mother, delivering them to the fetus or the baby via the umbilical cord, which is going to be attached to the baby's belly right there. One last thing that I want to show, which is the difference in the size of the uterus in a pregnant versus non-pregnant body. And so here we have the uterus during a pregnancy, full term, and here we have the uterus when there's no pregnancy. And it's just kind of amazing how much the uterus stretches over the course of the 9 months of the pregnancy. You can see that in this visual right here. All right, now let's take a look at the 3 stages of labor and birth. The first stage is dilation, followed by expulsion, and then the placental stage. Dilation is where the cervix is being prepared for the baby to be pushed out. Expulsion is the process of actually delivering the baby, getting the baby out of the mother and into the world. And then the placental stage is the delivery of the placenta after the birth of the baby. And now let's take a look at the birth simulation from Anatomage. And so here we have a full-term pregnancy. We're going to take away some of those layers so we can see the fetus and all the internal structures that we're interested in. And actually, let me back that up a little bit here and take a look at the dilation stage first. You can see we have all of these organs kind of squished up here because of all the space that the fetus is taking up in the belly here. We have the placenta, the fetus here inside the uterus. The cervix is going to be right in here, and there's the vagina. During the dilation stage, the cervix is dilating or opening up, preparing for the baby to be able to pass through. At this point, we've moved into the expulsion stage, so the baby is actually being born. The head is delivered first. We'll see some movements take place, and then we'll have the shoulders coming through. So that's the expulsion stage. So now the baby has been born. The umbilical cord will be cut right in there, and now we're into the placental stage. So the placenta will detach from the uterus, and the placenta is born. So those are the 3 stages of labor and birth. Let's see that whole process again, but we're going to zoom in a little bit more now, look at Anatomage visuals again, but now we're just going to look at these organs themselves, that are involved in the process. So first we have the dilation stage, and so we see that cervix dilating. Now we're pretty dilated there, and the baby's going to start to pass through. Now we've got the expulsion stage. The mother is pushing. The baby's head has been born at this point. We're going to have that rotation again, and then the shoulders are going to come out through this vulva right there. And then the baby has been born. We're going to cut the umbilical cord, and then we're in the placental stage. Placenta has detached, and the placenta is born. So again, the 3 stages of labor and birth. And I want to keep in mind some goals for each stage. So the goal of the dilation stage is to prepare or dilate the cervix to prepare the path for the baby to be born. It's all about just getting ready for that next stage, which is the expulsion stage. The goal of the expulsion stage is to maneuver the baby through the cervix and through the pelvis. The pelvis, of course, are these 2 bones that there's an opening in, and the baby's got to pass through that opening. And so that's why you have some of those different movements that take place during the expulsion. And finally, the goal of the placental stage is to deliver the placenta. So first, let's take a look at the onset of true labor. What's happening leading up to that dilation stage? Now, before the mother enters into that dilation stage, there may be false labor contractions, or what we call Braxton-Hicks contractions. These can be mistaken for true labor contractions, but oftentimes they won't be increasing in frequency, so they won't be getting closer together, and they won't be increasing in the duration. So from one to the next, they're not going to be lasting longer. So these are going to be the false labor contractions. True labor contractions, on the other hand, will be increasing in their frequency, so the time between each one will be getting shorter, and they're going to start lasting for longer and being a little bit more intense than the previous contraction. True labor contractions are also often marked by the amniotic sac rupturing or water breaking. And that can be a little bit of fluid coming out, or it can be a lot of fluid coming out. However, the water does not have to break for there to be true labor contractions and the beginning of this dilation stage. Another sign of true labor contractions can be the mucus plug being expelled, or what's called the bloody show, or the showing of blood. That mucus plug will be in the cervix, so right in here. And that mucus plug is going to have the function of preventing like bacteria and different stuff from making its way through the cervix and infecting this area where we want the baby growing and developing during the pregnancy. So that mucus plug is there to protect the baby, but when the baby's getting ready to be born, that plug is expelled. So once true labor contractions have started, then we're into the stages of labor and birth, starting with the dilation stage. The dilation stage is broken into a few phases. First is the latent phase, and second is the active phase. Sometimes a third phase is included here called the transition phase, and that would be at the very end of the active phase. Now, several changes are taking place during the phases of the dilation stage. The first is contractions. Contractions are going to start very irregular in the latent phase, so they're not going to be happening at regular intervals, like the same amount of time in between each contraction. Over the course of the latent phase, those contractions will get more regular. And then as we move into the active phase, those contractions are going to get more intense, they're going to get more frequent, as well as they're going to last for longer. To give a few kind of average numbers and ranges, during the irregular contractions, those could be anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes apart between each contraction, and they'll be lasting maybe around 30 seconds or so. Toward the end of the latent phase, those contractions are maybe 3 to 4 minutes apart. They're going to be lasting closer to around a minute. And then eventually during that active phase, the contractions will be just a couple minutes apart, and they'll last anywhere from 60 seconds to 90 seconds. And by this point, for a hospital birth, the mother will have been admitted somewhere back here towards the beginning of the latent phase, so she's being observed and everything in the hospital if they're choosing a hospital birth. Now let's talk about why these contractions are getting more frequent and more regular. And to do that, we're going to take a look at a homeostatic feedback loop. So we have our pregnancy diagram right there, and let's also add a cross-section of the brain because the brain is going to get involved in this process. So during this dilation stage, the baby's head is going to be pushing against the cervix. And there's going to be nerve endings in the cervix that are going to be detecting this baby pushing on the cervix. And those nerves are going to be sending signals to the brain saying, hey, the baby is pushing on the cervix. The brain then, the hypothalamus, is going to be telling the pituitary gland to start releasing a hormone, the hormone oxytocin. During these stages, the amount of oxytocin produced by the pituitary is much, much greater than it is during other times. So the pituitary gland is flooding oxytocin into the bloodstream, and that oxytocin is going to travel throughout the body, but specifically to the uterus, signaling for the uterus to contract even more. Now the uterus right here is contracting and pushing down on the baby. And of course, when the uterus is contracting and pushing down on the baby, that's going to cause the baby's head to push even more against the cervix, which of course is going to send signals to the brain, tell the pituitary to release more oxytocin, which is going to travel through the bloodstream to stimulate the uterus to contract even more. And we have this positive feedback loop that's causing these contractions to get more and more frequent, more and more forceful, and to last longer and longer. And so this is, of course, our classic example of a positive feedback loop, whereas a negative feedback loop will work to counteract a change that's happened in the body. A positive feedback loop is going to work to cause that change to become even greater. The change in this case being the contractions of the uterus. So this positive feedback loop is causing the contractions to become more frequent and to last longer. Now there's some other changes that need to happen here, and that's going to be cervical changes, changes to the cervix. So here we have a diagram of the fetus right here. We've got the cervix right here and the vagina, and we're going to see some changes happening to the cervix right here. 3 changes I'm going to list out. One is going to be softening of the cervix. So the cervix starts out pretty firm because it's there to protect the baby, and hold it in the uterus. So the cervix starts out pretty firm, and over time during this phase, it's going to soften. We have dilation, and I've got these left and right arrows there because it's going to be opening left right here. Like this gap right there, which starts out very, very small, is going to be widening. And so we're going to be dilating that, and that's going to be measured in centimeters. How many centimeters dilated or how many centimeters wide is this gap in the cervix right here? Also, the term cervix is referring to the fact that it's circular. And so we don't really see that in my cross section right here. But if you were to look at the cervix kind of like straight on, it's going to be a circle right here. And right now the cervix is dilated 0. And then over time, it's going to dilate more and more and more during this phase. We also have effacement of the cervix. Effacement is going to be, on my diagram, more vertical right here. So it's going to be the thickness of the cervix. And we're going to measure that in percent. So at the beginning, we have 0% effacement, meaning that the thickness of the cervix is at 100% of its normal thickness. And then over time, it'll get thinner. So let's look at another diagram to kind of see these changes that are taking place. So in this diagram, we've got some effacement and some dilation. Right here, we can draw some arrows here to show the effacement. And so at that point, maybe we're 50% or so effaced in this diagram. And then dilation would be more of this arrow. And we can see we've got several centimeters dilated at this point. Also, the 3 diagrams I'm drawing right here are not exactly lined up with the phases right here. I'm just showing this process of dilation and effacement. And then in our 3rd diagram right here, now we're going to be pretty much completely effaced. And so the thickness of this is down to close to 0%, which means that we are 100% effaced. And the dilation has increased. And so now we're getting closer to that 10 centimeters of dilation, which will mark the beginning of the expulsion stage. So 10 centimeters dilated, that's where we're moving from dilation, ready for expulsion to actually start pushing from the mother, like pushing with her abdominal muscles, trying to force the baby out during the expulsion. If the amniotic sac did not rupture at the beginning of the dilation stage, at this point it will have ruptured. And there's also a couple other hormones involved in this. There's going to be prostaglandins from the placenta. Prostaglandins from the placenta will also be triggering uterine contractions. Those prostaglandins will be helping to continue to trigger the uterine contractions as well as to soften the cervix. And the hormone relaxin from the placenta will help to relax the abdominal muscles and facilitate these cervical changes as well. Now let's take a look at the expulsion stage. I'm not going to go super in depth with all the terminology, but there's 3 orientations I do want to talk about. The first one is occiput anterior. Occiput is referring to the back of the head. And so in this case, we've got the occiput, or the back of the head, is anterior. The anterior side for the mother here, we've got a diagram of the mother and she's laying down. And this is going to be the anterior side right here. And so the back of the baby's head is on the anterior side. And this is the ideal orientation for the baby for a natural birth. The baby is facing down towards the mother's spine, and the head is pushed up against the cervix. Another orientation is called occiput posterior, sometimes referred to as sunny side up. And this is going to be similar to occiput anterior, but the baby, instead of facing down, is going to be facing up. And so the occiput, or the back of the baby's head, is on the posterior side, or the back of the mother. And then a third is going to be breech presentation, where instead of the baby's head being up against the cervix, it's the bottom of the baby being up against the cervix. There could be feet that are pushing up against it, or it could be the bottom right there. Any deviation from occiput anterior is going to make the birth more challenging and a little more dangerous. There's also something called a transverse lie, in which the baby's back is up against the cervix. Oftentimes in that case, natural birth might not be possible. For these other presentations, a C-section is pretty likely. Just it's a little bit safer if these are the orientations of the baby. In this video, for the fetal movements during expulsion, we're going to be looking specifically at occiput anterior orientation of the baby. Now, there's a little more anatomy we need to know to understand the different movements that are taking place during expulsion, and that's going to be some pelvic anatomy. So here we have the pelvic inlet, in other words, the pelvis viewed from above, and this is the space that the baby will need to move through right here. And then we've got the pelvic outlet. We're viewing the pelvis from the bottom, and this is where the baby is going to be coming out. Now we've got slightly different shapes here that we can see, and that's going to be really important here. So let me outline that pelvic inlet right here. It's outlined in yellow. And if you notice, it's going to be wider than it is tall. And so the long axis of the pelvic inlet is shown right here. You'll notice a couple things sticking down right here. Here's the coccyx and the sacrum. These pointy parts right there, those are called the pelvic spines. But those are a little bit further into the diagram. The first part that the baby's head will pass through is this part that I've outlined in yellow right there. Now, for humans, our heads as babies are very big, and our shoulders are kind of wide. So we're going to have to do some different movements to fit the baby through this. For the outlet right here, we're actually going to have the opposite for the long axis. So let me outline this. Here's our pelvic outlet. And the long axis is going to be from the pubic symphysis right here to the coccyx up right here. This is actually longer than the sideways part right here. So keep this in mind. Whenever the baby is entering the pelvic inlet, the baby needs to be oriented so that the longest part of those are going to be lined up with the long axis. So for the head, that would be the front to the back. That's going to need to line up with the long axis when it travels through the inlet. And then the front to back of the head needs to line up with the long axis here whenever it's traveling through the pelvic outlet. Same thing for the shoulders. The long axis of the shoulders is from the left to right shoulder. And so that's going to need to line up this way and then line up this way as the baby's coming out. So keep that in mind as we look at the movements during expulsion. All right, let's go back to our birth simulator from Anatomage to look at these fetal movements that are happening during birth. There's 7 movements we're going to talk about. The first fetal movement is going to be descent. The baby is going to be descending into the pelvic inlet. Let's sketch that pelvic inlet right here and the pelvic outlet right there, some approximations of where those are. Here's the pubic symphysis right here, and so the pelvic inlet is going to be right in there, pelvic outlet right in there. During descent, the baby's head is going to be passing through that pelvic inlet. Now notice something, notice the orientation of the baby's head. Which way is the baby's head facing? It's facing sort of sideways right here, because remember, the long axis of the pelvic inlet is horizontal. Technically, the baby's head isn't exactly horizontal. It's kind of at a more of a 45-degree angle, but generally it's going to be facing kind of sideways. And later on in a fetal movement, we're going to have some rotation of the head. So again, we have descent of the head right there. Next, we're going to have something called engagement, which are going to be halfway between the pelvic inlet and outlet. In my diagram, that's going to be right in here. We have engagement of the head. Station 0 right here, station -5 all the way to 0, and then to +5. After engagement, we're going to have flexion of the neck. And so if you'll notice the position of the baby's chin as we go through this next part, we can see that right here, the baby's chin getting tucked in right there. So that's the flexion of the neck. And then we'll have internal rotation. The baby's head needs to change from that long axis of the inlet, horizontal, to match up with the long axis of the pelvic outlet, so more vertical. It's called internal rotation because that rotation is taking place while the head is inside the pelvis. Let's take a look at that internal rotation here. There it was. And so back to here, the baby's head is sort of sideways, and we have internal rotation right there. Our next movement is going to be extension. This is where the head is actually going to be born. And if you remember, we have the chin pointed in, kind of tucked into the chest right there. We're going to see the head move back this way as it extends under the pubic symphysis right here as it passes out of the body. So here's that extension of the head. Baby is crowning right there. The baby's head is out. So we've had birth of the head. Now we got to get the shoulders through. At this point though, the shoulders are oriented kind of sideways like this, but remember the long axis of the pelvic outlet is more vertical. So now we have to have another rotation. We're going to call this external rotation because the head is external to the mother's body. And we're going to rotate it so the shoulders line up with that pelvic outlet. So there we have external rotation. Finally, we're going to have the final expulsion of the baby. So here we're going to have the anterior shoulder, posterior shoulder. And once the 2 shoulders are through, the rest of the baby is going to slide out pretty quickly because the widest parts were the head and then the shoulders. The rest of the body is going to be narrower than those. And so it's going to slide out pretty quickly right there. And we have the baby has been born. Now let's do a quick recap of those movements again. So let's put the baby back up in there. That doesn't happen in an actual birth. So we've got the baby right here. We're going to have descent and then engagement. We've got flexion of the chin. It's pointing up to the body. We're going to have internal rotation right there. Then we're going to have extension of the neck as it passes into pubic symphysis. The baby's head is born. Then we have external rotation, lining up the shoulders with the long axis of the pelvic outlet. Then we're going to have expulsion. The shoulders are both out, and the baby is born. Right after this, the umbilical cord will be clamped, and so we see the two clamps right there. And then the umbilical cord will be cut. And now we've moved into the placental stage. During the placental stage, the placenta will detach from the uterus, and then it will be born within a few minutes after the baby has been born. So here we have the placenta detaching from the uterus right there, and then that placenta will be born. I'm going to slide out there. And then now we're done with the birthing process. So now labor and birth is over, and we're moving on to the postpartum phase, which is basically a way for the body to return back to its unpregnant state. This is a gradual process that'll take around 6 weeks or so, and it starts with the process of involution. So the uterus will continue contracting for a few hours to return the uterus to its non-pregnant state, kind of shrinking it back to it's closer to its size that it was before the pregnancy. And then the abdominal organs will start to shift back into place. Because remember, all the intestines and bladder and stuff, those things were shifted out of the way because the uterus was taking up so much space in that abdominal area. Special thanks to Anatomage and the amazing work that they do. I've got a link in the description so you can check out more about Anatomage. They've got this birth simulation, which is really cool. They also have other case studies where you can look at different diseases and disorders and how those affect the body. They've got multiple cadavers that they've scanned so you can compare like the female anatomy, male anatomy, geriatric anatomy, pregnant anatomy. And they make these amazing life-size virtual dissection tables that really bring the anatomy to life. If you're learning all this stuff for a class, I want to make sure you're using the best learning strategies to maximize the time that you spend studying, right? Study smarter, not harder. I've got an A&P survival guide. It's free. Link in the description for that as well. And special thanks to my patrons on Patreon and my YouTube channel members. I really appreciate the support from you all. If you're interested in becoming a supporter on either of those, they get access to all of the slides and blank diagrams and all that stuff that I use in my videos. So check out links in the description for that. And thanks to everyone out there who watched the video and is learning anatomy. I love that so many people are learning about the body and how it works. And I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.